I'm just going to wait for one of you guys to give me a thumbs up, if that's okay. Excellent. Thank you, Adrienne. So, welcome to our fantastic event, Rethinking Black History with Dr. Shawn Sobers. We were due to have an introduction from Jane, our VP Education, but unfortunately she couldn't make it today. So you've got the secondary person, that's me. I am Nor Nixon and I work in the Alumni Engagement team, and I'm also a BMR Forum coordinator along with my colleagues. So this event is brought to you today, organised by the BME Staff Forum at UWE. But we are welcoming everyone today, so welcome. Thank you for joining. So just to let you know before we get started that this event is being recorded and it's going to be shared with the BME Staff Forum members, those that couldn't make it today. So, but to let you know that any comments or your personal information will be removed from the recording, okay? So we're celebrating Black History Month as we approach the end of the month. This is the last event at UWE Bristol, and we've had a month-long series of activities, some fantastic events, and we want to continue celebrating Black history throughout the year. So before we get started, I'll just need to give you a little bit of information about how today will work. As I said, the event will be recorded. You'll notice your microphone is muted, and that will remain muted for the rest of this session. But you will have the chance to raise your hand and ask a question when the Q&A starts. Please do post on the chat function with any comments as Shawn is speaking, and do share your ideas and thoughts. Shawn will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll go into a Q&A where we're up for questions. If you do have any questions, please do hold those until the Q&A starts, and then you can post those in the chat. You can also ask anonymous questions by messaging the moderator, and you can do that through the chat function and message moderator. We will also ask for your feedback at the end of the session, so I'd be grateful if you can just tell us how you felt this session went and whether it was useful. And before we get started then, a little bit about Shawn. He is our excellent colleague and he's very experienced. So Shawn is a filmmaker, photographer, writer, TEDx speaker, and of course, associate professor at UWE Bristol. As a filmmaker and photographer, his work has been exhibited and screened nationally and internationally, and he's directed and produced documentaries for BBC One and Channel 4. And the topics of his work is wide-ranging, including slavery in the UK, African presence in Georgian and Victorian times, and creative citizenship in social media. So before further ado, please welcome Dr. Shawn Sobers. Shawn, if you can unmute yourself.
Unmute myself. That's is there echo? No, I think that's okay. But I think that's the phrase of 2020, isn't it? You're on mute. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. As always, always seems like a good idea at the time saying yes to these things, and it gets closer when you start feeling the pressure. But hope you enjoy what I'm going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes or so. It's deliberately a polemic. You can't have a title such as Rethinking Black History without some kind of personal thoughts, and it is kind of just me touching base with a few things around the ideas of Black history, how it's kind of disseminated, how it's positioned. So hopefully there'll be plenty of discussion at the end. So yeah, as Nor said, I'm an associate professor here, and I'm not a historian. I am a filmmaker, photographer who works with history, and I'm very much interested in negotiating with history and bringing it to the present and seeing how it's related to the present. So a lot of my work does relate to historical topics and discourses. So to begin with, I want to bring the story into my own history. I want to kind of delve into, as I call, a memory that I shouldn't remember, and really is a memory that I shouldn't have to remember. It happened literally 40 years ago when I was 8 years old, when I was at primary school, or junior school as it was, and our teacher asked us to make a coat of arms for ourselves and our family, and thinking about what a coat of arms and a family crest, what that would kind of look like. And I remember this very vividly, this session, this class that we had. I don't remember what I put on the two bottom parts of the crest of the coat of arms, but I do remember what I put in the top two. One of them was a pencil. Art was always my thing from a child. Even leaving school, I left school at the age of 16 with 4 very poor GCSEs. So me doing this today and becoming an associate professor, that wasn't part of my, didn't look like my trajectory, put it that way. But art was always my thing. So I drew a pencil, and I remember drawing this pencil 40 years ago. The other thing I remembered was the top left-hand corner. I drew a hand, and that was like a self-portrait. That was me, you put your hand on the pencil, and that was kind of my way of doing a self-portrait rather than my face. But the thing I remember about this moment was that I remember making the conscious decision to put the paint into the brown paint, and to paint that hand brown. And I remember actually thinking, should I do that? Is that an okay thing to do? And then I painted the hand brown. And I was very conscious of doing this. And I remember my friend who I sat next to, I should put in context, I grew up in the city of Bath. I was the only black child in my class, and there were 3 only black children in the whole year group, one of which was my cousin. So, in that context, as an 8-year-old, I wasn't exactly surrounded by, representation that looked like myself. And I remember my friend who sat next to me, he looked at me and he paused when he saw the hand, and he said, "You drew the hand brown, you painted it brown." And I went, yeah, I did. And I remember this moment where we just kind of stared at each other for, quite a few seconds, quite a few heartbeats, where we just negotiated and realized this kind of moment. And it's really interesting for me. Obviously, as an 8-year-old, I didn't kind of deconstruct it in the same way that I'm doing today. I do remember it being a thing. And as 2 8-year-olds in that time, there could have been any number of reactions. One might be, I might have got embarrassed, for example. I might have got defensive. My friend may have, he might have been sympathetic. He could have even taken the mick, as children do. That just that moment could have been a whole set of interactions that could have gone either peacefully or not peacefully, depending on the dynamic. But I remember we kind of just, broke the ice and, laughed, and then, went and did something else kind of thing. But, I say it as this memory that I shouldn't remember, because painting a hand in an art class 40 years ago shouldn't be something that had this profound, visceral kind of, memory for me. But actually, it became a very significant moment. And in that moment, there was this kind of realization, this denormalizing of my black skin, if you like, this questioning of the hand being brown. Like I say, I was aware of doing that decision even before my friend asked me the question about that. It is almost like we saw each other as quote unquote different for the first time, or that first time that he recognized that brown skin was a thing to actually have represented. So this idea of taboo, the politicization of skin, weaponized, gone a different way, defended. This idea of being silenced, your skin not being seen, if you like. So this unseen curiosity. And also this idea of decentered from what is seen to be the norm. And I said in that space as well, there's that kind of sense of marginalization as well. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this idea of double consciousness, and what he says is double consciousness is a peculiar sensation, a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. And the way I always describe double consciousness is, you're walking down the street and you're just within yourself and within your own thoughts. But at the same time, you are, existing as an individual. You're also existing through the notional eyes of others. So you're always aware of how you're being seen, particularly in a white-dominated space. So you live in this duality, and he calls it this two-ness. And as he says, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dog strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. So is this idea that you always live in this duality, as you can sense from the language of Du Bois, is not a comfortable duality. It's actually a duality, this full of kind of tension and, as he says, kind of strife. And it's actually it's very exhausting. I definitely remember growing up living in the city of Bath, and always being really self-conscious with how I'm being seen, even when you're not doing anything, just doing mundane tasks, but always fully aware. And it's something that I think, lots of Black people in white-dominated spaces feel this duality, and actually we stop realizing that we've got this duality going on. It's just ever present, and it's there. But actually it does take an emotional kind of toll as well. So you get this kind of notion then that in colonized spaces, and when I say colonized spaces, talk about Britain as a colonized space, in the sense that it's a space that, as a West Indian, Caribbean, etc., Windrush generation, and then being Black in this space. So in this colonized space, mere presence is unintended political action, where we can get called an activist just from living, just from painting a representation brown. It's seen as a political act, when actually you're doing is a mere self-representation. So this unintended political action, when actually you're just expressing your own humanity, is often the case. I'm peppering this presentation with some of my own photography, as well as some photography of others. So, hopefully they're relating to the things that I say. So in this kind of moment of realization of your kind of Black self, your Black culture, go through these stages of personal revelation, this rebalancing of self and identity, and it's kind of a recalibrating to think, okay, well, there's something here to explore. Redressing the balance, even. The reason, like I say, I was always into art and creativity at school. When I made the decision to go to college, then on to university, when I was a bit older, it was very much this decision of seeing this, redressing the balance, and being kind of disappointed and disillusioned with representations that I was seeing in the media. And as a filmmaker, photographer, I wanted to try to redress that balance. So definitely had that kind of, agenda activist laden approach to why I wanted to get into creativity as a career. But also self-realization, and that's realization from self, but there's also realization from the notional expectations of others. So there's this complex interlinking with when you're coming into reclaiming, for want of a better term, your identity from a personal level. But then, as we know, the personal is political, and it enters the political realm very quickly. Linda Tuhai Smith, she's a Native American, Aboriginal, Native Australian scholar, very well known for this book, Decolonizing Methodologies. And what she says is, to acquiesce is to lose ourselves entirely and implicitly agree with all that's been said about us. I could have very easily not taken on these kind of challenges of representation like many others have, you know, taken on this challenge and just accepted representations. As someone who feels they have something to say, and as an artist I have feels things that I want to kind of express and say, then actually you can't just turn a blind eye. You can't just agree with everything that's being said about you, and you want to put different stories into the narrative space. So to resist is to retrench into the margins, to retrieve that what we were and remake ourselves. The past, our stories, local and global. The present, our communities, cultures, languages, and social practices, all may be spaces of marginalization, but they also become spaces of resistance and hope. So even there, in that notion that you've got these personal spaces, you've got personal stories and narratives in your own local communities, as she says here, you know, they spaces of marginalization, they become spaces of resistance, but also hope. And as we know, without hope, there is no kind of resistance. Without no hope, there is no activism, because you're striving for something of change. So again, that personal becomes political in those personal spaces. The thing I want to concentrate on is this idea of the past, our stories, local and global, and particularly. And throughout this presentation, what I'm going to do from this point onwards, there's essentially 12 points that I want to kind of put up as kind of polemics, if you like, of suggestions, of ways of thinking about Black history and our approaches possibly to Black history and how we kind of positioning it. So as we go through, I'll be flagging up these 12 points. So I'm starting off with this idea of the local. So first point is decolonizing the curriculum is a must. And there's lots of talk about decolonizing the curriculum. But what I kind of argue that is also as a Black male, as a father, you know, as a family member, a member of the community, I also say that it's also too important to leave just the schools or also institutions. And this isn't a criticism of teachers of schools. We know that teachers in schools have their own capacities, issues, you know, constraints on government and Ofsted and these kind of things. But also we know that schools have expertise constraints. Because as we know, the fact that we're asking for the curriculum to be decolonized, we know that Black history isn't taught in schools in the way that we would want it to, you know, the fullness of it, the nuance of it. And sometimes it can just be very tokenistic and, you know, Black History Month assemblies, etc. So we already know that the teachers that are leaving school, going on to do PGCEs and then becoming teachers, we know that they themselves haven't had a grounding in Black history. And as Aisha Thomas always says, representation matters. She's a local teacher, education thinker from City Academy, and she's part of this one Bristol curriculum, which I'll just mention in a moment. So needing more Black teachers, absolutely a key and a thing, but also to have an embedded, you know, Black history within schools where you've got teachers that know and have that nuance of how to talk. It also needs to come from the home. It also needs to come from our communities and supplementary schools, Saturday schools, and each one reach one mentality where family members are also co-educating, etc. It can't just be left to institutions. And being Black and being, you know, grown up in this space, why would I want my, you know, sense of self to be handed over to an institution when I know that institutions have often failed that community? So I think Black history is too important to solely leave at the doorstep or the criticism even of institutions. And I think those of us within communities that have got certain access, I should say, to certain knowledges or information need to also step up to the plate. And, you know, work with other like-minded individuals. Learn from the griots, the griots. The griots is a West African members of the community. They're the poets, they're the oral historians of their community, they're the singers, they're the keepers of the oral traditions. and very much within kind of family, village, and community based. And I kind of like this idea of the griot: share, tell, pass on, using your platforms. We've got access to all these platforms these days, but what are we doing with them? What are we saying? How are we actually, creating different consortia to actually generate and use platforms in different ways? So I'm very interested in this idea of, collective accountability with Black history, and how we kind of are disseminating that with different people. The telling of Black history is not owned by historians. I never claim to be a historian. Sometimes I'm labelled as one with different spaces and platforms that I, get on, but I wouldn't ever say I'm a historian. I have undertaken original research. I have gone into the archives and blown the dust off papers, and I definitely do enjoy that. But actually, I'd also say that Black history as a discourse has a very strong, autodidactic tradition, if you like. Go to any community, go to any kind of pub or cafe, or in any kind of Black community, you're going to meet someone there who has knowledge from the top of their brow to the tip of their toes, and they're talking at you with all this knowledge that they've got from books that they've read and people they spoke to and analysis they've done. And they may never have set foot in a university, never set foot in a college, and they may have left school when they're 13. But the knowledge that you find in Black communities is incredibly immense, and that's not something to be underestimated or ignored even. So I just want to flag that up. Make stories available and archive is something. And I talk about this in the next sort of section, but I think it's really important that when those of us who are undertaking different aspects of kind of research is making these things available and accessible, because often these things are locked away, we're not thinking they're important. One thing I just want to mention, one Bristol curriculum, we're talking about schools not having capacities, or Bristol's lucky enough to have different consortia, individuals that have come together, and one Bristol curriculum is one of them, where they're looking at how school curriculum can start to embrace these ideas of the African and Caribbean contribution to British society, and also Asian contribution to British society as well. So, these things don't happen in isolation, and people are coming together to work on those areas. But in terms of going back to school and where we see our Black history curriculums and knowledge, where we're gaining that information. I'm a child of hip hop, and Boogie Down Productions KRS-One was absolutely one of my classrooms. So I'm gonna now attempt something. Genesis chapter 11 verse 10 explains the genealogy of Shem. Shem was a Black man in Africa. If you repeat this fact, they can't laugh at you. Genesis 14 verse 13, Abraham steps on the scene. Being a descendant of Shem, which is a fact, means Abraham too was Black. Abraham born in the city of a Black man called Nimrod, grandson of Ham. Ham had 4 sons. One was named Canaan. Here, let me do some explaining. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons for real, and these were the children of Israel. According to Genesis chapter 10, Egyptians descended from Ham. 600 years later, my brother read up. Moses was born in Egypt. In the era, Black Egyptians weren't right. Enslaved Black Israelites. Moses had to be of the Black race because he spent 40 years in Pharaoh's place, and he passed as a Pharaoh's grandson. So you had to look just like him. Yes, my brothers and sisters, take this here song. Go correct the wrong. The information we get today is just whack, and ask yourself, why is that? So that's a lyric, a verse from a song called Why Is That by Boogie Down Productions, released in 1989. I left school in 1988, age 16. 1989, break dancing days were gone by then. But as a child of, when you see these kids with, with their headphones on, and their hoodies up, don't underestimate what they might be listening to in their headphones. There's some deep knowledge in hip hop. It gets a bad press with, you know, elements of misogyny and etc. etc. And it definitely, you know, that gangster rap thing. But, you know, there's a whole tradition in Black music and Black popular culture which is incredibly deep and profound and knowledgeable. And this was definitely one of those moments where I was really kind of tuning into history and different things that I was told at school and church that started to not align and not to make sense. So as a, you know, theology scholar might those lyrics and start to question, well, you know, we're not quite sure you know, the Shem is not conclusive fact to say that he was a black man in Africa, etc. But you can contest those facts. But if the criticism of the evidence of those lyrics are inconclusive, why do images like the one on the right, representation of Jesus, why do they become so ubiquitous and perpetuate so profoundly? And the images on the left actually then become, you know, as I said earlier, that looks like a much more politicized representation of Jesus, when actually it's just a picture of Jesus in the same way that the one on the right is. But all of a sudden, when you start putting in these different representations and questioning, then it becomes, again, not the norm, it becomes decentered, etc. So we have to look at these things, and, you know, these notional norms are so deep within society that it always, you know, gets put forward as, you know, an activist activity, when actually it's you know, it's just trying to tell a different story, it's trying to question, but your very presence of doing that gets on to be taken as something else. Number two, capture the specific and intergenerational stories of everyday people and everyday life, especially in your own family, if you're fortunate to have a family unit around you. Intangible and material culture history is as important to preserve as the tangible material culture. So I'm very interested in everyday life, and, you know, the stereotype, I think, of Black history is you get narratives of the kings and queens and the heroes, the inventors. But I'm also interested in everyday life representations. You know, who's the person who kind of lives down the street? Who's the cleaner? Who's the bus driver? Who's, you know, who's your uncle? Who's your parents or your carers? What's their story? Because everyone's got a story, and I'm very much interested in exploring their narratives and not just the people that we see as quote unquote pioneers that have achieved these kind of landmark moments, etc. This is a series that I did with my friend Nadia. She's an actress, Nadia Williams, and she wanted, it was her mum's birthday, and she wanted to recreate some photographs that she always saw on her mantelpiece of her mum. So we worked in the studio and just sort of did these kind of playful recreations. These were shot in Bar Ashton studio. And after she got the pictures, you know, she was pleased with what we did. I said to her, okay, well, now you've done these recreations of these old photos, why don't you know, ask your mum and interview your mum about that moment, about what she can remember as a young woman back then. And Nadia assumed that I wanted to go and interview her. I was like, no, I don't need to be in the room. Just do it on your mobile phone. And, you know, if you're comfortable with it, send me the audio. And I have the audio on my website that accompanies these pictures. And it's just a very interesting kind of mother-daughter exchange where Nadia was asking her mum questions, and there were certain assumptions about where and how these pictures were taken. And her mum said, oh, these pictures were taken in the living room that we had in our first house. And I was pregnant at the time, and Nadia assumed she was pregnant with the brother, and mum said, no, I was pregnant with you at the time. And Nadia was, oh, right, I didn't know that. So there's this very little kind of personal stories and exchanges, these kind of little intergenerational moments. But the mum was talking about how, you know, she just wanted to feel nice, feel good, so she hired a photographer, got herself made up, and turned her living room into a studio. And it kind of says something about, you know, her at that time, her aspirations, how she wanted to feel, how she wanted to be seen as a young woman in the kind of, you know, late 1970s, early 1980s in Britain. This was a project that I did in 2007 around the bicentennial of the Abolition Act, Slave Trade Act, and is in partnership with the National Trust, looking at where different properties got their money from in terms of slavery. But this lady, Daisy, I've known her all my life. She's a friend of the family. She came into this room in Durham Park, just on the edge of Bath, and she just had this very visceral reaction, started to see her just getting very visibly upset and quite angry even. She said the room just had this kind of oppressive feel on her, and it started to make her think about how, you know, the people in Durham Park and the family, Braithwaite family, who own Durham Park, you know, they can trace their lineage back, and you see it on the walls and in the scrolls, you know, centuries. You know, they can trace their lineage back a huge amount of generations. And it made her remember that when she was trying to trace her own documents to get some documents about her father, and she just hit this brick wall in one generation, she just couldn't find any other information. And she just had this kind of sense of oppression. And the women on this tour particularly, because we went with this elders group, they said that above stairs in these stately homes, they felt incredibly kind of oppressed and quite claustrophobic. Whereas when they went into the kitchen and the below stairs, they could feel like they could relate to it, because that's where work happened. And that, you know, there's a very obviously a gendered based relational aspect to that, which I'll get into in a moment. But I thought there's a very interesting kind of reaction that the women particularly had in this space that wasn't expected. Gordon Parks is a well-known filmmaker. He's like known for directing the film Shaft. Before that, he's a very renowned photographer. In 1942, he took this photograph of Ella Watson in one of the government buildings. He's part of the Farm Security Administration, and he called it American Gothic. And I'm sure you'd know the Grant Wood picture of the man with the pitchfork and the woman stood just behind him. It's also called American Gothic. So this is a play on this American Gothic painting. And he said that even though he knew about racism before, you know, growing up, it wasn't until he moved to Washington in 1940 and working as a kind of this professional photographer that he actually started to see racism for the first time very profound. He wasn't allowed to go into the front of buildings, even as a photographer, he'd have to go around the back. And he became interested in the cleaners who were cleaning the government buildings that he was commissioned by to make work. So he started talking to Ella Watson, one of the cleaners, and she, you know, he worked with her, spent time with her, and started to take photographs, and then created this. And she spoke about how her own father was murdered by a lynch mob, how her husband was shot and murdered in a violent attack, and, you know, started to, you know, exhume the you know, her narrative, her story, and who she was. And as well as race in this dynamic and this conversation, there's also class elements in this conversation, these dynamics. And this takes me to my next area in terms of the discourse of Black history. By its very nature is intersectional, because Black history, Black experience, you know, whatever you want to call it, Black life, living, as we know, we're not this homogenous mass, as no one is. And we exist within different spaces, different professional spaces, different social spaces, relational spaces, but also different class spaces and gender spaces. So Black history itself is intersectional. It's in relation to other aspects of society. One thing I'm always interested in when it comes to class particularly is that I believe that race scholars don't talk about class enough, and class scholars don't talk about race enough. And I think class, particularly in Britain, but also the United States, you know, the United States likes to think itself as a class of society. I know it's different and don't really have time to really get into the nuances, but class does play a big part. And I think it's important when we're looking at, you know, the lived experience, particularly in relation to intersectionality, in relation to race and racism, and dynamics of exchange, that we look at the intersectional spread, class, gender, disability, inability, sexuality, age, and other areas of protected characteristics. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, started off as very much a discourse about Black women. So it's kind of looking at how, particularly, with the power movement, for example, it was talking about Black community, interests of Black people, but it's very much this notional idea that it was talking about the interests of Black men and not the interests of Black women. So Black women became erased in that conversation. And at the same time, the feminist movement on the rise at the same kind of time that the Black Power movement was on the rise, that was seen to really be speaking to the interests of white women. And again, Black women were erased in those conversations. And so Kimberly Crenshaw kind of talked about, actually, as Black women, we have this position, we have this strength, but actually becoming invisible. But she talks about how the better we understand how identities and power work together, from one context to another, the less likely our movements for change are to fracture. So she's saying, rather than retrenching into our notional silos, she knows those silos are, in a sense, a myth, because they don't make sense as silos, because you might be a Black man but you're still male, might be a Black woman but you're female and Black, etc., etc. We all have these dual, multiple overlapping identities. So rather than a retrenchment, it's actually an understanding of these different overlapping identities and the relations to power and oppression that goes along with that. Stuart Hall, Jamaican British academic, cultural studies thinker, he did talk quite a bit about race, and talked a lot about race, talked a lot about class as well. As race, he says, race is more like a language than it is like the way in which we are biologically constituted. So he talks about race as dialogue, as a discourse, not as a biology. So I think it's interesting to look at race as more like a language than a biology. And about class, he says there's no permanent fixed class consciousness. You can't work out immediately what people think, what politics they have, simply looking at their socio-economic position. So again, it's saying there's a nuance there. And that complexity is what intersectionality is very much about embracing and challenging. This is a photograph. I was interested in those class dynamics. I'm wearing a St. George Cross t-shirt, and it's called St. George for All, and it's looking at how St. George isn't only the patron saint of England, he's also the patron saint of Beirut, of Catalonia, of Ethiopia, Genoa, Greece, Lithuania, Milan, lots of other spaces that St. George is the patron saint of. And, can't get into the details now about, the relationship to St. George, nationalism, etc., and the white working class in England. But those nuances are there in terms of how the white working class are kind of positioned against, in relation to the aristocracy, the people power, and who we see and what we class as racist. Because we know there's very deep structural racisms in society that are very entrenched and movable. And that's very different to someone on the street who actually themselves are a victim of this society, having disillusioned, ignorant thoughts and calling you the N-word or whatever. There's a continuum and a dotted line, but there's a dotted line that needs to be kind of unpacked. But actually, what's the real danger in that equation? Actually, I would say it's about the institutional, structural power relations that need to be dismantled. And actually, that individual who's actually misguided with their politics, with their racist attitudes, they're a product of that environment in the same way that we're a product of that environment. So we all need liberating from this white supremacist and racist society. We all need liberating from that. So again, going back to Kimberly Crenshaw's notion that the better we understand the complexities of those identities and how power feeds into those and actually exploits them and makes you fight against each other while actually those power structures exist and seemingly are immovable. I better move on because I'm noticing time. Number 4, unheard stories. So this is about myself, my own practice. I often called what I did with my projects Untold Stories. I was very interested in stories that are on the margins, you know, that haven't had mainstream airplay. So I used to describe what I did was explore untold stories. Actually, I realized a couple of years ago that's actually not right. And actually, the more accurate is probably unheard stories rather than untold. And I say here's part of our work, not only to amplify our own work, but also amplify the work of others. So very quickly, this is my most recent project, my most recent film. I actually shot it 10 years ago, but I'm actually been working on it recently, and I'm showing it for the first time in public in 2 weeks' time at COSAR Contemporary Gallery in Bedminster. And it's a film, it's a photographic film, like a video installation, and is looking at the story of Sarah Forbes Bennetta. Sarah Forbes Bennetta, she was an African princess. She was captured into slavery, in terms of African continent slavery. She was brought to England by a gentleman called Frederick Forbes, Captain Frederick Forbes, and she was given to Queen Victoria as a gift, and she became protege of Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria became godmother to Sarah Forbes's daughter Victoria Randall. So there's this really interesting interweaving of African aristocracy, if you like, an African woman in Victorian royal aristocracy, society, etc. And it's a really interesting story. But it's not an untold story. If it's the first time you've heard that story, it's not because it's been untold previously, because actually there are people that worked on it. I'm not the first person to have told that story or been interested in it. I first heard about that story in 2009. Dr. Caroline Bressie from UCL spoke about it at a conference that I was at. I then bought out of interest from what she was talking about by Walter Myers, and he's written this book about it. So it's not an untold story, but it's very much an unheard story. It hasn't been taken up by the mainstream. It hasn't been kind of lauded in the same way that some other histories get put on a platform. So it might be a nuance, but I think it's an important nuance that it's not an untold story. 2016, David Olusoga, in his British series, he talked about the life of Sarah Forbes Bennetta. This was after I'd shot the original. It's interesting to then see how he told the story. And he talks about how Sarah's life, she became a project to show, the Royal Victorian English society, how African people can attain English standards of civility. So it gets talked about how Frederick Forbes rescued Sarah from this kind of barbaric situation, and don't know the truth of that, but that's how that's been positioned. So he gets positioned as this hero figure. But then at the same time, she's given to Queen Victoria as a gift, which is then obviously those notions of property, which harken back to obviously slavery and colonial thinking. But then this idea that, okay, she's going to be taken under the wing of Queen Victoria, and this African is now going to become civilized within English, society. And that itself is obviously incredibly problematic, regardless of whether Frederick Forbes saved her life. It's that notion of then, that savior, and bringing this African woman to civility, etc., is extremely problematic. And so Sarah's life becomes this embodiment of trying to prove to white society that Black people have humanity. And is one of my, I guess, challenges. This isn't a kind of a challenge at any particular project specifically, but I do sometimes tune into the register or the target of the vocal in different, even in poetry, sometimes you hear, and you still hear how, certain thinking, certain voices are written very much with a white audience in mind and trying to convince a white audience or readership or listenership that we have humanity. Please listen to us. I'm begging you to know that I have humanity. We were kings and queens, etc., etc. And it's actually, absolutely, things need to be heard and agendas need to be set and awareness needs to be. It's also problematic in the sense that putting whiteness on a pedestal, in that sense that we're pleading for this humanity to be granted to us, and that has problematic notions underpin that. So one of the questions is around what stories are we telling, why, and to whom? Whose voices are we using? What's our target audience in mind when we're having these conversations, when we're doing these projects, where we're writing our academic papers, etc., when we're doing our TV shows? Who are we speaking to? What is the voice that we're using? And just very quickly, I've got a personal disclosure, so even on social media, on my social media, I've got academics, I've got rastas, I've got people I went to school with, all mixed up. So when I'm talking about one thing, sometimes I found a few years ago, I thought, why am I over explaining something? It might be like a Rastafari celebration. And in the post where I'm kind of saying, blessed coronation day for Haile Selassie, which is 2nd of November, coming up on Monday. And I'd find myself over explaining who Haile Selassie was and what the coronation meant. And I'm thinking, actually, you know what? I'm starting to write to this kind of notional white audience that I feel need explaining to, rather than just being embodied, living in the moment and living my truth. And actually, that is that double consciousness creeping back in. And I think is an interesting thing to keep in mind. Toni Morrison was fully aware of this. And I'm not saying, when you're writing for audiences, it's not, again, this homogenous idea, because actually I've got plenty of black friends on the Facebook page that would have been interested in that nuance and that description. It's not to say that everyone would have known the details. But at the same time, how Toni Morrison talks about it is that the function of racism is a very serious function, and that's one of distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you from explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, you spend 20 years proving that you do. Someone says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Someone says you have no kingdoms, and you dredge that up. And none of this is necessary. As she says, there will always be one more thing that you have to prove, and you have to prove, and you have to prove. And I think it's a very sharp, important point that Toni Morrison makes. So number 6 is the need to speak about the Black experience with an unapologetic and authentic voice. But and aligned with that is the need for our white allies to speak out about racism, also with an unapologetic and authentic voice. And I'll just give you a very quick example of a personal example of what I mean by that. On that same National Trust project, and I'm aware I definitely do have to speed up, so I'm going to start speaking very quickly now, like I'm reading out terms and conditions on a mobile phone. So back in Durham Park on the edge of Bath, and we went into this room, and as you can see here, there's these 2 big sculptures, they're called jardinières, of these black figures, these African figures, and it's actually got chains around their neck and around their ankles that you can see in this photograph. And the tour guide spoke about every single thing in that room for 15 minutes, talked about the carpet, the lights, the table, and not once mentioned these 2 huge statues that were staring us right in the face. And it is very much that thing of what was unsaid. William Braithwaite, who owned Durham Park, he was an insurer, and he made his money from insuring, slave trade, like voyages, etc. That's how he made his money. So he wasn't directly a slave trader or a plantation owner, but he's very much in the business of the slave trade, and that was his economics. So those links can't be denied. But it's very much about what was unsaid. So even if the tour guide felt uncomfortable and they didn't know how to articulate it, the very fact that it was just ignored and swept under the carpet caused real resentment in the group that we were with, and upset and real hurt that it just wasn't being addressed. On exactly the same project, we took a group of young people to Clevedon Court, and I don't have time to kind of read back, all these nuances, but the children on the coach on the way back started to get upset because they knew, because they'd already done the research and knew that the Elton family who owned Clevedon Court would make their money in slavery, but not once was it mentioned on the tour. And one of the children saw steps that went down to a basement, and she made this assumption that was the dungeon where the slaves were. And you can see how when things aren't addressed properly, it creates this vacuum where myths can enter, where resentment can enter, assumption, and it can cause more problems than good. So actually speaking out and about racism and speaking the truth about these things, even if not quite sure the way, the full nuance of the history and the details, is still better to talk openly and address it rather than not address it and, as they say, sweep it under the carpet, because it really does more damage than good. So what isn't said can be as damaging as what is said in the Black history discourse. While we're on the subject of slavery, this is now me over-explaining, but I have to talk about it every time I do talk about the pedagogy of enslaved practice, is there's no such entity as a slave. If you're talking about Africans that were in that chattel slavery condition, then you're talking about enslaved Africans. You're not talking about slaves. You're not talking about African slaves. They were enslaved, and you deny them their humanity by calling them a slave. We're talking about people that were enslaved. But while we're on the subject of transatlantic slavery again, and we are just hanging on in there to October, I'm personally not keen on events about slavery and Black History Month. And this is again one of my polemics, if you like. I'll probably forgive this year because with the Colston toppling statue, etc., it's understandable how this is going to be a hot topic. But as Muta Baruka said, slavery is not African history. Slavery interrupted African history. And as I got here, slavery is as much British and European history as it is Black history, even more so because that's where the motivation resided. So to understand the motivations, to really understand the slave trade, we have to understand European history and British history and notions of whiteness, etc., that allowed those conditions to perpetuate. It's not a Black history or an African history. It very much is a British history. I'm not going to talk about this in huge detail because of time, but this is me exploring my relationship to enslaved Africans, Delia and Jack. They were enslaved in South Carolina, and these portraits were unearthed, found in the Harvard Institute where they reside today. And this is me talking about the empathy, the connection, the African kinship that I have with my ancestors, direct and indirect, that went through these traumas. But here I am in the middle, and I'm acknowledging that even though I have a connection and empathy, I haven't walked in their shoes and I can't experience directly. And here I'm with a mobile phone. I'm in charge of my own representation, where Jack and Delia were very much victims of this representation. And the picture of Delia is a well-known image in this kind of archive, because it looks like she's got tears in her eyes. But here, as the photographer, I'm putting myself front and center and being very reflexive with my positionality. And here I want to kind of get into, then there can be this tacit expectation for Black scholars and also artists to be reflexive and declare our Blackness and to state our proximity to Blackness, the community, to organizations being researched, etc. But white scholars who study Black history and, part of that kind of tradition, there's not really an expectation on white scholars to state their whiteness or their positionality, and there's little expectation to do so. So it was one of my good friends said yesterday when I was talking about this, is almost, that they could be like they're hiding behind their whiteness. And it's not a critique, but I think it's something that needs to be acknowledged, that there is this difference, and there are still these very problematic and unchallenged notions of norms that do live with it, still exist within the academy. That even as a Black scholar, that sense of just being very transparent about your positionality and how you relate to the field, etc., actually feels normal, often feels more comfortable, it feels more honest. I think that's why a lot of us do it even as artists. But you still have this notion within the academy of being this, objective researcher, scholar, and nothing that you do will affect the findings, etc. But we know that's a fallacy because we've been on the other end of that and know that things that are being said about us are very much untruths and not true. So on my final one then, at the last minute, Johann Galtung, he wrote he's quoted in a book by John Cooper, Anthropology and Anthropologists, and it's a nice quote that I kind of picked up, which is, he says, a painting used to hang in the ante-room of former President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. The painting was enormous, and the main feature was of Nkrumah himself fighting, wrestling the last chains of colonialism. The chains are yielding. There is a thunder and lightning in the air. The earth is shaking out of all this. 3 small figures are fleeing, white men, pallid. One of them is the capitalist. He carries a briefcase. Another is a priest or missionary. He carries the Bible. And the third, a lesser figure, carries a book entitled African Political Systems. He is the anthropologist. And even as a photographer, I would actually extend that. I'd say there'd be a 4th person running who had a strap around his neck with a contraption bouncing against his chest, and he was the photographer. Because photography, anthropology, sociology, lots of social sciences, lots of kind of physical sciences grew up at the same time as colonialism, were extensions of it. So these subject areas don't exist within a vacuum, and this is again where the decolonising curriculum conversations need to look and need to really address itself. So one thing I start to ask, maybe provocatively, is it time for Black history scholars to turn the tables of an analysis and look back at white societies, and it's for us to now take notes in the same way that the anthropologists and the photographers and the missionaries, etc., were gazing at us in our quote-unquote exotic homelands, taking notes on us? Is it now just time for us to look at whiteness and Britishness and Europeanness and us to take notes and analyse what actually is going on? So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you're still there. It's very weird talking into this black box, but I'm going to stop sharing and hopefully still people in the room.
Thank you, Shawn. That was fantastic. There's a few of us still here. Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and we could go on. And I'm sure there are a few questions from the room. So if anyone does have any questions for Shawn, please do post on the chat function. And if you would prefer to ask a question anonymously, please click on the chat speech mark and click on moderators, and then we will then ask the question on your behalf. If anyone would like to speak, please do raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So it's open floor. Please do go ahead and ask questions for Shawn. So I do have one question, Shawn. Recent news we've seen in the press, the History Commission in Bristol, and you were mentioned. Can you tell us about your involvement, what that's all about?
Yeah, the History Commission, is great to be asked to take part in the History Commission. So it's called the We Are Bristol History Commission, and it was formed by Mayor Marvin Rees after the toppling of the Colston statue. And it was kind of looking at how is the city now going to move forward in the wake of this, what became a global event, and how is history and use of history going to help us with those conversations and take us forward. I've known Marvin for a long time. I directed a TV program that he presented for BBC One in 2007. It was kind of looking at the abolition year and the dynamics around that. And so it's an honour to be asked. And again, not as someone who isn't a historian, but I am interested in how history is communicated, and particularly the public engagement of history. Yeah, I was definitely honoured to take part. And what the History Commission is, really, I don't want to know, I'm not speaking of the whole commission, but it's looking at Colston and slave trade as a starting point, but it's also looking at wider Bristol histories as well, in relation to class, in relation to gender, and these other histories that the city's going on, and very much thinking about, okay, got to this point now, how can we now get to a point of conversation, of dialogue, of healing, do you know what I mean, and to really start to see these overlaps and commonalities, rather than these very entrenched positions that politics finds itself in, really. So yeah, it's good. It's early days, but I'm also the link person on the commission to work with the curators at the museum about how the Colston statue is going to be displayed when it goes on its first display after being toppled. So that's a big responsibility that I'm sure will be a very thankless task, but I'm very pleased to be involved.
Fantastic, that's brilliant. Thank you. Another question about intangible history, and you talked about making history very much in the present. How would you propose that people record intangible history from previous generations?
Well, I think actually it's something that I kind of take for granted as a filmmaker, etc., to know that actually, you know, if I want a interview with my parents, for example, I can just stick the mobile phone in front of them, press record on the app, and just get them to talk. And often when we think about interviewing some people, we kind of sometimes magnify it to be, you know, this really important thing, and all the questions need to be written down. And actually, just having a recording a conversation with the people that are close to you. Everyone's got a story, and often we have no idea of the stories of the people actually raised us from a child, regardless of who they are, you know, blood family or not, sort of thing. I remember the first time that I interviewed my parents is in 1996. Is what I moved to Bristol in 1996 after doing my degree in South Wales. And I was involved in a book called Origins, and the editor was Geraldine Edwards, God rest her soul. And it is all around migration stories. Who came to Bristol and how did they come? Well, Southwest. My case was bad. But what were the migration stories of people? So in that book, I wrote a short story. I also interviewed my parents. And I remember that when I interviewed them, you know, it's the days before mobile phones. You know, this is in 1996. I had a dictaphone that I had from university, and we were actually driving back along the M4 from visiting my family in Southall at the time. And I said, oh God, yeah, I need to interview you. So we used the journey. I just pressed record. I was sat in the back with my sister. I just had a conversation with my mum and dad about how they came to Britain, why did they move to Bath. And, you know, we spent the whole 2.5 hours driving back from London to Bristol with me having this conversation with them and recording it all. And I found out so much in that 2.5 hour conversation than I had in, you know, what age was I then? I can't remember, like, I don't know, 26 or something. So interviewing people around us doesn't have to be an arduous task. It doesn't have to be really formal. Just use voice notes app or anything, you know, anything like that, and just have a conversation. It just opens up so many stories, avenues, further questions. You know, you don't have to make them public. You can stick them on SoundCloud with a password and share it with other members of the family. But I think those things actually are really important to document. And we have to count our blessings if we still have people around us that are able to do that. Actually is a good time to do it, because obviously we don't know what tomorrow might bring, kind of thing.
Great, thank you. That's brilliant. Just recording, it's just a simple thing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And as our you know, as the Windrush generation and our parents and grandparents as they're getting older. So important to get those recordings and keep them for the next generation. So,
really vitally important, really are. And
yeah,
Black Southwest Network, BSWN, they're doing a whole project around intangible cultural heritage. So they are interested in people, you know, that have recordings and how they archived and how they made accessible. So they do brilliant work.
fantastic. Thank you. So the next question, you're involved with the Critical Race Network. Can you tell us a bit more about that network and what's involved?
Yeah, so Andy Graff Johnson, Emmanuel Duqua and Xavier Baker, we kind of formally set up and founded the Critical Race and Culture Network earlier this year in June. And it's something that we've been talking about for the last couple of years. You know, it's gone through different names and how is it going to work. But actually, this summer, it's just like, okay, you know what, let's just do it. Let's just get on with it. Let's just launch it. So it's a university-wide research group, research network, and it really is looking at how can we start to embrace research and research projects and conversations around race and culture in the university when we have lots of different research groups and research centres, but none of them at the moment actually deal with race and culture as the specialist kind of topic, if you like, of conversation. And it might enter, you know, I'm a member of different research groups, and when I do a project, you know, I bring that with it, but very often you might be the only one in that space that's actually got a specialist interest in that. So it's a way to come together, and it's not just for academics, also professional service staff can become members, students become members, and also independent researchers as well. So still very much early days of it, but we've got, you know, is a good start, and then we're kind of pushing that forward. So I'll be sending out communication on that. So yeah, the critical, I should know the website off by heart, shouldn't I? So I'll get the website and I'll stick it in. One of you might be fast enough to do that. But yeah, I'll stick it in the chat, and there's a form you can fill out to ask to become a member, and then we'll get back in touch with you. But yeah, the Critical Race and Culture Research Network.
Critical Race and Culture Research Network.
Yeah.
UWE.
So the website is criticalraceculture.com.
Brilliant. Criticalraceculture.com.
Yeah,
thank you so much, Shawn. If you can post a link, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
And just to say thank you, Yuko, Vienna, Alison, for your comments. Really glad you're enjoying this. And another quick question from Zena. Are you still friends with that boy from when you were 8?
Brilliant question. I haven't seen him for a long time. I'm not mentioning his name, you know, he's got his own anonymity. But yeah, we were good friends, you know, up through secondary school. We were good friends and in and out of each other's houses all the time. I haven't seen him for a long time now. I still know where he lives, and you know, I still would consider him a friend, definitely. But from 8, we then spent time at school together up to 16 when I left. So yeah, it wasn't harmed by that experience. That's a really good question.
Fantastic, thank you. Lorna has a question. How do you conceive yourself, more of a scholar or an artist? The interweaving of the scholarly with the artistic is powerful for Lorna.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's one that I've kind of negotiated with a long time. I mean, you know, I always occupy in between spaces. So I teach photography, but my research isn't really photography. Do you know what I mean? Research is these other things. I end up in conferences with anthropologists or with historians and these kind of things. My MA was anthropology. So my degree, I should bit of a long-winded story, Lorna, but I'll keep it concise. My BA was film and photography, a practice-based experience. My MA was purely theoretical, anthropology at SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies, and my PhD was looking at community media, but it was purely theoretical. It wasn't by practice either. And I do kind of position myself as a visual anthropologist. That is a kind of a discourse and identity that I feel kind of comfortable with, even though I wrestle with the identity anthropology thing, but that's a different story. But what I have come to embrace, and I think you've seen this today, is that what I feel comfortable is talking about those things through a creative practice kind of framework. So talking about my own films or photography and using that as a starting point to then talk about history or science or, anthropology, whatever it might be. And I learned it the hard way, because I have been at conferences like a sociology conference, and then, you're speaking in the afternoon and you end up rewriting your whole talk in the lunch break, and then you go in and give a talk. And I've definitely given talks where I was trying to be talking like a 100% sociologist or anthropologist or historian, but you start to become unstuck, because that's not my natural place. Actually, is a practitioner that uses those things in my practice rather than the other way around. So I would consider myself absolutely an academic. I am a researcher. I've written research papers that have got nothing to do with photography and arts, etc. But at the same time, I have to live my truth and know that I'm not a historian, but I work with history. So to go back to the question, I say I'm an artist. I would say I'm an academic. But when I give these talks, I try to bring both things to the table and not leave one thing outside of that, if that makes sense. So I think that's what I've tried to do with this talk today as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Lorna. Hopefully that's answered your question. I have a question from Jane. Do you feel the burden of responsibility to represent a whole community, and how can we be good allies along this journey of challenging and changing culture?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there is this, it's about this double consciousness thing. I would never claim or attempt to speak for a whole community. I do a lot of work in a place called Fairfield House in Bath, where there's a very large, significant Rastafari community, for example, and I've done a lot of talks around that. But I always have to say I'm speaking for me. I'm not speaking for a whole community, and I wouldn't ever claim to. But there can be this notion that when you are speaking, that you might be representing a whole community, particularly, when you have to do kind of media interviews and things like that. So I'm always really clear, and I try to be clear, I'm never speaking for anyone else. And I think in terms of allyship, again, it's a really good question. It's very difficult to answer those things. But I think with allyship is also to recognise that Black people aren't speaking for whole communities either, to take us as individuals, not to take us as homogenous. But at the same time, when I spoke earlier about how we're all victims of this society, I myself, when I see people on TV, and then you might be saying certain things, Black people, and I'm thinking, and again, the double consciousness creeps things. You're thinking, oh, people are going to be thinking that they're talking about, that's how all Black people are, type thing. But again, I shouldn't underestimate white people to assume that's what they are going to think. But again, we're all victims of this, very mixed up situation where we can be assuming, self-doubt, etc., etc. But actually, white people aren't that naive to think that if they see a Black person on, a reality TV show, that represents all Black people. Do you know what I mean? That, so it's not to underestimate anyone either, really. So I don't think that really answered your question, Jane, but it is about the individuality, not the homogenous, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's about exposure and how much you've been exposed to different types of people from different cultures. And I've been watching Desmond recently. Do you remember?
Yeah.
And not in those days, in the 80s and 90s, Bristol wasn't as diverse as it is now. So you didn't see so many black people or Asian people, and they were in pockets in different parts of the city. But you know, what you saw on TV was often what you were
Absolutely.
exposed to. But certainly, we're in a much more diverse community now. But the other part of Jane's question was about allyship and challenging the changing culture. Would you have anything to say about how to be a good ally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think one of the things that this summer has taught me and really come to consciousness is this difference between non-racist and anti-racist. And the charge is is no longer good enough to just be non-racist, where actually you might not be racist as an individual, but at the same time you might not be saying anything, doing anything, or challenging anything. But you have to be anti-racist. You have to be calling it out, and actually making a stand, even if it's people close to you. And I guess, I've known that, but I think this summer has been when I've seen that being sharply articulated, to say actually it's no longer good enough now just to be a good person. If you actually really are an ally and really against racism, then it needs to be challenged, spoken out. I definitely know that I've been in situations where lots of people in a room, meetings, and you're thinking, there's no one else spotted what I've spotted. Why is no one else speaking up about an inequality or something that's slightly suspect or something that's missing maybe from the agenda or something? Is it only me that can see this? And sometimes they think, well, actually, you know what? I'm not going to say anything. Why shouldn't it be me to say that? Or other times, like, no, I will speak up because you're in that space and you have to represent. So, but often, as if you are the only black person in the room, it's actually, uncomfortable to always having to be speaking up about that. And that often you want someone else in the room to actually say it. So it's not like, oh yeah, there's the brown kid talking about that again, raising it again. Actually, it shouldn't always be us raising those issues. So yeah, I think it's a complex one, but hopefully that speaks to it.
Brilliant, thank you. So next question from Vienna. Would you say there are complications with double consciousness with regards to dual heritage people? Or not necessarily complications, but in the way that they would internally deal with two-ness and the duality?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, Vienna. Yeah, that's really good question. And again, yeah, double consciousness by definition boils it down to a black and white discourse. And actually, as Vienna's saying, there's nuances within those identities, and there's quadruple consciousness, there's colorism consciousness. And yeah, I think it adds complexity to that theory in a dual heritage situation. So yeah, you've hit the nail on the head with that, Vienna. It's a theory that only gets you so far, but actually intersectionality, I think, is the thing that actually has more, I guess, currency when you get onto that level. So yeah, really good.
Great, thank you. Zena asks, tell us more about your video launch next week.
Oh
Where
yeah.
can we see it?
So KOSAR Contemporaries, KOSAR Contemporary Gallery. It's actually the final exhibition that's going to be there because it's moving. It's actually founded by a former graduate of UWE, actually, alumni, Zara Kayani, or B Kayani. She did fine art MA with us. So she runs this gallery and studio space. So yeah, I've been invited to take part. So it's from the 6th to the 8th of November. The address is Little Paradise, which is a beautiful address in Bedminster. So if you go to, I think if you just sort of Googled KOSAR Contemporary, you would find the web address. And, because age of COVID, you'd have to book certain time slots, etc. It's a really big space, and there'll be lots of great work in there. My good friend and colleague, Yuko Edwards, she's got some fantastic work in there, and yeah, lots of other people. So yeah, it's really good to take part in that. So yeah, thanks for asking, Zena. So yeah, KOSAR Contemporary.
Brilliant. We'll try and post that in a moment as a link. If you do have any more questions, we do have 10 minutes left in the session. But I have another question for you, Shawn, whilst we're waiting for any more. You did some research into Haile Selassie and Bath and the connection. What triggered your interest to look at that history?
Yeah, I'm gonna definitely cut this one short. I mean, growing up in the city of Bath, I not always, I occasionally heard, oh, the Emperor of Bath, the Emperor of Ethiopia used to live here in the city of Bath. You know, it wasn't a mainstay of conversation. Never once did I hear about it in school or anything. But just a couple of people would mention it. And I myself started to, get close to the Rastafari tradition and start to walk into that tradition. So became interested, obviously, in Haile Selassie as a figure. But even then, it was still very much this kind of unknown thing. So I started to do my own research, found where the house was, and started to get involved in that way. When I then left, went to university, got a job at HTV. Abigail Davis, who's a close colleague here, I first worked with her at HTV, brilliant Abigail Davis. I produced a documentary called Footsteps of the Emperor, and when I pitched it to the producers, I said, I want to make a film about Haile Selassie living in the city of Bath. No one knew that he lived there, still very much one of these unheard histories. So when I came back with the research that I'd had, they said, rather than just give you one half an hour, we'll give you 2 half an hours, because there was such a big story to tell. And it started from there. So that went on television in 1999. And I've been involved in Fairfield House ever since, really. I'm now a trustee and a director of Fairfield House. So that we manage the space. We're doing an asset transfer to take it off the council, because the council wanted to sell it as a private residence. But Haile Selassie actually gave the house to the city in 1958 to be used by older people, and it's still used for that purpose today. So we have people from all over the world visit Fairfield House, from the Rastaf community, Ethiopian community, and other people that are just generally interested. So yeah, it's a fascinating history. I've done quite a bit of research on there, connected with UWE. There's now a blue plaque on Fairfield House that was a result of a research project that I was doing a couple of years ago. It's one of these places that since going there 20 years later, I'm still there, and it's just this magical, wonderful place. It really is a really hidden gem. Yeah, real hidden gem.
Yeah. Brilliant. So it's last call for questions now. We just have a few more minutes left. So any more questions for Shawn? So a message there from Rose. She says, "Thank you, Shawn. Was rereading your chapter on reinterpretation today. Cheeky request. Have you got time to pop in and see some of my heritage students?" Little pull there.
Thanks, Rose. How can I possibly resist a public invitation? No, I'd happy to. It's a very small world. Rose's mum lives next door to Fairfield House. I won't give away the address because of that, but there's a strong connect. Rose's mum is a very talented artist, and she did, Karen, her name is Karen Wallace, Dr. Karen Wallace. She did a residency at Fairfield House where she did these amazing drawings of the elders as they're kind of playing dominoes and doing their crafts and things like that. It's really beautiful. And Rose is, part of the tradition of a very talented family. So, yeah, of course, Rose, of course.
Very kind of you, Shawn. Rose, hope that makes you happy. Lorna, another question. She says, like you, I'm interested in changing narratives. What are your views about this in relation to Black boys and education?
Yeah, it's a big one. Black boys and education, often, there's so many ways of answering it in a short space of time. One thing that I'm conscious of when I've done projects in schools, I did a lot of work, spent a lot of time in schools, is that often I think black boys and girls can be treated as if they're older than actually they are. You know, they're children, they're at school. But often when it comes to discipline and expectations, they're treated as if they're adults rather than children. I think that misconception is actually really damaging and dangerous. You know, these are children and should be treated as such. The alienation that I know black people can feel, black boys can feel. You know, puberty is a very alienating time for lots of people anyway. But then when you add into that dynamics of feeling marginalized and misunderstood and misrepresented, whole things there. When I went to a school where the detention room, whatever, the exclusion room, was just full of black children. Were in that exclusion room, they weren't being given any work. They were just there to just look at the walls and not do anything kind of constructive, which is going to cause its own problems. And I had to say to the head teacher, the fact that your whole, you know, exclusion room is full of black children, that's a problem with the school, not with the children, because actually it's your job to engage, to try to, you know, to try to be that stewardship. So I'm not saying all children are saints, and I'm not saying that none of them had done anything wrong or challenging, why they might have wanted to, you know, children are children, and absolutely. But at the same time, it's really important that that schools also take on that responsibility as well.
Thank you, and I think that feeds into the some of the work going on in the city, particularly Aisha Thomas from City Academy,
Absolutely.
Who is working on the lack of black teachers in Bristol. I think 26 teachers out of about 1,200. So, you know, representation is an issue as well. And Anne says there's a race equality in education group that people can join if they wish to. Another comment from Lorna.
No, it isn't that they can join, but there is a race equality in education group that's working on looking at race inequality in Bristol.
Okay, so it's good to know that there's more work going on. Lorna says she'd love to speak to you more about defying the odds, and as a black female academic who has written about this, she'd like to speak to you more, Shawn. So
absolutely, definitely.
Brilliant. So as we come towards the end of this event, any more final questions, please do post them. So you can see Shawn's exhibition at COSAR Contemporary between the 6th and 8th of November. You can watch Shawn's TEDx talk, and posted the link just there. And if you're a UWE member of staff and you're interested in joining the Critical Race Network, the link is also available there as well. Any final comments, Shawn?
No, I mean, just thank you for the conversation afterwards, the questions, the attentiveness. No, just, I've really enjoyed the afternoon, so or the evening. But yeah, thank you for everyone's input. Good. So I just see Yuko's comment about KRS-One.
Be proud, absolutely.
I'm just remembering that I did a rap in the middle of that. I'm having flashbacks about my rap.
I wish we had some closing music of KRS-One or something. But yeah, after this we can play some music.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for your time and being so generous.
Thank you for the insight.
Please, the audience, please do fill in our feedback form so that we can continue some of these events, maybe a continuation from this. Hint, hint, Shawn. And it will help us to plan future activities. Thank you so much all for taking the time out on a Friday evening to join us. If you are a member of staff at UWE and identify as from Black, Asian and minority ethnic, we would welcome you to join the BME Staff Forum. Please take a look on the intranet for that. So this event has been brought to you by BME Staff Forum at UWE. Thanking Alicia and Samia and Shawn, thank you all so much for your work to bring this together. Thank you to the audience for joining us. This is the last event of Black History Month. but let's not finish talking about Black history. Let's continue on throughout the year, and we will be in touch. If you fill in the form and if you've left your email address, we will let you know about upcoming events that we organise. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Right. Should we head on into our group, if you like, Shawn?
Yeah.
Then how do I leave?
Aha, on the top left-hand side,